Welcome to Grumpy Strategist, the Makers series. This is episode 3 in the Makers series. I'm Michael Shoebridge and I'm joined by Robert NIOA, the head of NIOA, a fabulous Australian family company specialising in weapons and munitions. So, Rob, great to have you on the program.
Thanks, Michael. Very, very good to be here.
This is all about what Australian companies are actually doing and making. And I think NIOA is a fabulous example of a company that's got quite a long history. So you started back in 1973 selling weapons to the sporting market, but then along came Port Arthur. Why don't you talk about having to reshape the business at that time?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I mean, we were a very small company, really only 7 or 8 people. So we've been on a journey, now 50 years in the firearms market. That event caused us to reevaluate the market we were in and how we were going to keep our family business together going forward, and it necessitated a diversification. We decided to target the law enforcement market, which actually led us to the military market, and that's now 28 years ago, and I led that transition to what is now really government, business, law enforcement and military.
Right,
and it was a long journey.
It was kind of an existential business threat because the sporting shooting market pretty much evaporated with that event, with John Howard doing that famous speech.
Yes.
So you either had to reorientate the business or it was gone.
Yeah, diversify or get out.
Yeah.
And that's what we did.
And from then, in the 28 years since, you've grown a diversified business that's starting to get into missile partnerships and manufacture.
Yeah.
As well as some of the critical munitions that we see that are so essential in current wars, like artillery ammunition.
Yeah, so it was a very speedy 19 years between our decision to get into the defence market to when we got our first prime contract.
Only 19 years?
Only 19 years. But that took a lot of hard work and a difficult road that a lot of small companies are on and want to be on in Australia. But yes, where we've got to today, we have physical locations in Australia, New Zealand, the US. In the US, we've acquired recently Barrett Firearms, so we make all of the sniper rifles for the US military, and export to about 75 State Department approved countries around the world. In Australia, the key elements there, we're running significant procurement programs for munitions for the Department of Defence. They're the future family of artillery ammunition. We have that contract called Land 17. The major munitions contract, which is a suite of munitions products. We operate half of the Australian government-owned ammunition factory in Benalla in Victoria. We have a joint venture with German company Rheinmetall in Maryborough, which is at my hometown, so that's where the business emanated from.
Heart of the business?
Yes, and we're making artillery shells there, and then we run weapon procurement programs, Land 159 Tranche 1 for the Australian Department of Defence as well.
So you've had to become literate in the internal defence language, Land 17,
yes.
Land 159, 17B, 17C.
Yes.
One thing that's interesting when I look at your company footprint is it looks to me like you're working directly with government strategic directions. Your markets are really the Five Eyes.
Yes, so we're trying to be very responsive to the customer. I think in any business that's obviously pretty important to be aligned with your customer and the direction. We are definitely targeting the Five Eyes nations, and so the geographic footprint is now in 3 of those 5 countries, and we will be looking very soon at how we address the UK and Canadian end of that. The largest market in those 5, of course, is the US. And recently we established a tenancy inside the wire at Picatinny Arsenal in the US, which is really that's where the conventional munitions industrial bases run from.
It's really
for
the
US
hub
military.
for US conventional munitions production, isn't it? And the US is busily reinvesting in that too.
Yes, they're very, very, they've got a mature view on how to run an industrial base and what they require from an industrial base. But even anything we're doing in Australia, really the decisions for export, licensing, technical support, all really comes out of Picatinny. Those decisions are made there. So having a footprint there is as much about supporting our Australian ongoing activities as it is about finding a path to grow within the US geographic footprint.
So if you looked at it, AUKUS has happened, then AUKUS is being enabled by things like the export control reforms here in Australia and in the US. That's at the sort of high government level and Congress. But then at the business level and working directly with the US military, that Picatinny Arsenal is really the interface location.
Yeah, that's the hub of business for delivering the products that actually bring to life all of this transfer of technology and these sort of intergovernment arrangements.
So looking at the munitions side of the business, that before the war in Ukraine, I think everybody would have said, well, we're relying on global supply chains. It's not a strategic necessity to produce things like 155mm artillery rounds or 120mm rounds for tanks or 30mm rounds. We just buy them from the big suppliers offshore. Things look very different after the war in Ukraine because all kinds of munitions, but particularly artillery, are in critical global shortage.
Yes. There was a bit of foresight with government when they put in place long-term contracts with us, like the Major Munitions Contract and Land 17 1C2, and that is they are 5 + 5 + 5 year arrangements. So it was very good strategic planning at that point, and yes, at that point in time, the cheapest, easiest, most expeditious way to get the requirements for the government were simply exercising that imported supply channel.
Which is part of what the business does.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But what we did do was get into those contracts an ability, should the government require or the circumstances require, the onshoring of some or all of those supply chains for those elements. The mechanisms are within those contracts should we wish to exercise them. So I think that was very good foresight on behalf of government. And in fact, we have exercised some of those elements already. And so you'll see with our partner Rheinmetall, we've established medium calibre production of 30mm medium calibre production at Benalla at the government factory.
Which that's a calibre that the combat reconnaissance vehicle would use, for example.
Correct. And we've done some exports to other allied nations from there already because of that core capability. Certainly the artillery shell forge was born out of that original Land 17 contract, and 120mm tank ammunition has also come out of that. So we've established 120mm tank light assembled pack capabilities in Benalla as well. So there are elements of that are good. There's good foundational contractual arrangements which can be leveraged. I think we are now, with the change in the strategic circumstances, likely to see an acceleration of that transition from overseas supply to domestic. And there's multiple reasons why we should do that. One of which is just to help our allies. We shouldn't continue to be a drain on the US supply chain if in fact we have surplus manufacturing capability that is sitting latent.
This is one of the big things in AUKUS, isn't it? And it hasn't really been in the public conversation. AUKUS wasn't designed for Australia to lean more and more on America and the UK. AUKUS is meant to help all three of those partners. Yeah. And when you look at the consumables of conflict and munitions and guided weapons, we know that the US isn't able at the moment to produce enough to meet its own need. The last thing it wants from AUKUS is two needy partners. It wants to see Australia more than lifting its weight and able to supply into US and other partner needs.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think that Australia is lagging behind in its decision-making timeframe to decision to actually action that type of contribution. And it is what's making it more challenging, I think, for the members of the Defence Force that are looking at that, is that we don't have a local industrial base capable of simply making all of the things for us to contribute.
No, so if looking at, say, the artillery shells, what kind of capacity of shell production can you get out of the Maryborough facility?
I mean, forges around the world are pretty well known in their capacity, and a traditional forge, which is the bottleneck operation or the limiting factor of a factory, is around 100 to 120,000 shells a year is what you typically get out of any particular forge. Now,
so to put that in context, that's about a month's worth supply of the Ukrainians, for example.
Correct.
Right,
yes.
Which is pretty significant. If you ask the Ukrainians, would they like a month's worth of artillery shells, they would say yes.
Yes, and the US is is very much public domain information that they're targeting 100,000 shells per month. So they're building their industrial base to around 1.2 million shells a year. So Australia would have the capacity right now to be about 10% of the size of the US, and given the size of our respective markets, that's not an insignificant contribution.
I think that's exactly the kind of contribution that AUKUS is meant to deliver.
Yes.
So if you're thinking Australia can't make a difference to artillery production, that would be wrong just on those figures. Of course, more would have to happen. We'd have to increase our ability to fill those shells. You can produce the shells.
Yeah, we definitely we wouldn't be able to fill that many shells shells, in my understanding, and so we need more investment. So, I think this is where the problem becomes a much larger problem for desk officers to solve. This can't be solved by desk officers.
Because it's a system problem, isn't it?
Yeah. So the metal component of an artillery shell is critically important, and it is a bottleneck around the world. But we need a fuse, we need filling, we need a primer, we need combustible cartridge cases, and we need propellant. And we do not have the current capacity to do all of that in Australia. And in fact, if you're going to get fusing, you really want guided fusing for artillery now.
Yes.
So that instead of having to fire 20 artillery shells to achieve an effect, you want to fire one.
And that's been a difference between the Russians and Ukrainians, hasn't
Yes.
it? The Ukrainians have had more of those precision rounds,
Yes.
and that's partly how they've managed the scarcity of supply.
Yeah. And think, though, that the stocks of those are limited.
Yeah.
And they are things that Australia could be leaning forward right now. We could be making guided fuses right now in Australia and supplementing the US supply base for that.
And having the ability to supply more of the consumables of conflict to our own military in a time of
Correct.
crisis. Yeah.
So I think that we need to probably look at the industrialisation challenges in a much more connected way. And firstly, we have an overriding obligation to the people of Australia in order to have industrial capacity here to defend our nation. People will say, or the public might say, well, we are not in a conflict, therefore we don't need it now. And there's a ramp-up time and taking public on a journey which has to occur, which I think we understand militarily and the government level, that is well understood.
Well, industrial lead times are years, aren't they? You can't just say, whoops, we're in a conflict.
Yeah.
It's March now. I would like to have production in April. Putting the Maryborough facility together, what was that, 3 years?
Well, you've got a year of planning before you can start turning dirt. You've got to know what you're going to build. You've got a couple of years of construction and ordering of equipment. We don't make the equipment in Australia that goes in the factories that we need.
Yeah.
So we're relying on an overseas supply chain even to make the equipment to go into factories. Before
the
we built the
Russians
factory.
use a whole lot of European machine tools.
Yes.
It's true for them too.
Yeah. But, to get these specialist bits of equipment, so there's lead time for all of that. And, of course, we're in competition now for other nations that are building their industrial bases. So when you go to buy a new artillery forge or you go to buy some specialist piece of equipment, there are only a limited number of places in the world that make them. And, by the way, every other country on earth
is queued up.
So,
well, and what are you seeing with other governments looking at their defence manufacturing firms? Because I think, go back 4 or 5 years, governments were saying to their defence companies, get out there and expand globally, produce in other markets. That's what you're going to do. There seems to be a bit of a shift there in governments' attitudes.
Yeah, then there was two business models. Some European countries particularly actually took shareholding in large numbers of their defence companies, encouraged them to go overseas. The profits came back. Essentially, that subsidised their own defence
subsidised the
costs.
home market by exporting.
Correct. So it became a sponge to absorb the world's money from friendly governments to bring it back to the home market. So they essentially are getting almost their defence industrial base for free in the home market. Other countries, that was a different model, and they were happy for their companies to build up that scale and expertise in foreign markets because they were quite comfortable that they weren't in their own market. They actually didn't like in peacetime to be seen to be building up capability.
Well, the Germans have been an example. They have before the Ukraine war, the idea that they wanted to produce weapons was anathema, really, wasn't it? There was a bit of a struggle.
Yeah, and I think that would be the same for maybe Japan. I don't know Japan overly well, but I suspect that might be. Maybe there was some issues there as well. But what we're seeing now is home governments are calling foreign companies, or what we would call a foreign company, home. And they are saying, we don't care if you've got latent capacity or capability in America or Australia or India or wherever you might have production. We want production on our own soil. And you will build new factories, new capability, and you will do it here. And
that's a big shift in priority, isn't it, for the businesses?
Yeah.
But it also shows the power of the home governments.
Yeah, it does. And Australia is not, we are a little bit unique, or I think we're quite unique in how we operate our defence industrial base compared to other allied nations, and we have really outsourced to foreign companies and markets our industrial base. Now, there's a difference between, it's a big long debate maybe for another podcast on definitions of sovereignty and all those things, and we start to get wound up in what is a domestic or sovereign capability as opposed to what is a domestic or sovereign company. And
well, to me, one big point, and we won't get into it in great detail, Marcus and I have done a podcast on the industrial strategy and that definition that's popped out of defence, but having an Australian business number is not enough. Having production here is not enough. The critical factor is the one you mentioned, where the home government of the companies can direct their priorities in times of need.
Yes.
So the home government is the critical factor. And we see that, frankly, with the whole China debate.
Yeah.
What's a Chinese-owned company necessarily going to do? It's going to obey the directions of the Chinese government. Well, guess what? During the pandemic, we saw that same behaviour from European companies, and we'll see the same from US companies.
Yeah. I think the challenge for Australia is that we are very much reliant, even on the things that we might assemble in Australia or service in Australia or make a component for in Australia. We're not making all up things when it comes to the consumables of war, like munitions, and we are currently completely reliant on the international supply chain at a time where home governments are demanding those components for their own supply chains.
Yep, they're setting the priorities for those supply chains.
Correct.
So how much of the risk can we retire? And I suppose part of your business strategy with NIOA is you retire some of that risk by the partnerships, say, with American companies and by enabling that tech transfer between the US and Australia.
Yeah, so we've embraced the Australian government's preferred method of operation, and that really is bringing foreign technology to Australia, enabling that here, making sure our munitions are interchangeable with the US and other allies, rather than actually create your own orphan product. So that's a response of what the Australian government and Department of Defence wants. And I think that's a completely workable solution, but we need to move to the next stage now. And that is with relationships we have with Rheinmetall in Europe, with Nitrochemi, Jungens, Rheinmetall Denel, Northrop Grumman, Aerojet Rocketdyne is a new one, Winchester, Lake City plant, lots and lots of companies that we have around the world. We need to start on a path where at the moment we would be importing those products, some of which we then do load, assemble, pack.
Yep.
Then we need to look at the subcomponent supply. So where is that home market? What's the bottleneck? If it was a cartridge case or a primer or a propellant or an explosive,
if that's going to be the thing in
fuse,
critical shortage, what are alternatives?
Let's focus on that.
Yeah.
And let's focus on it not for two things. One, for our own supply chain surety. But the second thing is to assist that, to be a better partner, an industrial partner to our defence partner. And I think we're seeing lots of talk about defence and government-to-government partnerships, but we are yet to talk about the integration of the industrial bases properly.
Yes.
And a fully integrated industrial base across AUKUS.
They're trusted
across Five Eyes.
commercial and industrial partners as well.
Correct.
You need to have that trust. Yeah.
And we need to
but
be...
for that, you need longer term contracts, though, don't you? Because I look at things like the armoured vehicle decision, stringing two countries, governments and companies, Germany and South Korea, along for over a decade. And then at the end of it, one of them loses, but the winner gets it cut by 2/3.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that was really thinking about the government-to-government and industrial partnership messages that were being sent there. So to me, longer-term industrial partnerships are enabled by government partnerships. But the big thing that makes them happen are longer-term contracts.
Yeah. Well, it's longer-term, yes, so I'm saying we need to shift to a different gear. We definitely need the long-term commercial arrangements, and we need to connect the pipe from one country or factory to Australia. The other thing is the actual decision to go and manufacture, bring onshore some of the critical components for manufacture in Australia cannot be made by a company
It's
alone.
not a company decision, is it? Because there's a whole licensing thing, and in Australia there's the use of the government-owned facilities.
Correct. So government-owned facilities require the Department of Defence to want that thing to be made there. Physically importing controlled items requires the Australian government either to be an end user or to provide permission. So they have to have an appetite to want to actually approve those sorts of activities. So, and then you need the demand signal, because if, for example, you were going to talk to an American company about transferring a critical technology to Australia because Australia thought it was a good thing, unless Australia's going to buy it, they won't do it. So because there's also other countries that want that technology.
And right now there are a lot of other countries wanting that technology. So a government policy signal isn't enough, is it? It's got to be, is this a sustainable business proposition?
Correct. And I don't think this is very hard. These are not hard next steps, and they are logical next steps. I actually have some reasonable confidence that we will get those discussions and those decisions potentially coming.
Well, I suppose there are a couple of bright spots on the near horizon, aren't there? When you look at what Defence is doing, so the strategic review is over a year ago. They've been restructuring their investment plan. Hopefully the May budget will reveal that to the world.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not sure what to expect with the May budget, but that aside, there are probably two fundamental activities that are going to shape this year and potentially progress us from an industrial base point of view. The first one will be clarity within the rebalancing of the integrated investment plan program. If that occurs, which really should be completed before the middle of the year, would be an expectation. That would provide long-term clarity. It will clear up which programs are going to be cut, which ones are going to be funded, and it should allow contracts to be issued for multi-year contracts to go out and start delivering the capability.
It releases the government investment, and hopefully in a longer-term way.
Yeah, so that's not new money, but what it is it says government can now spend on the following things, and I suspect there's going to be some disappointment in that, but it will at least allow the things which are funded to move ahead. So that's a really critical enabler which should occur, I would expect, I don't know, but you would expect before the middle of the year. The other thing which is new money, and that was money announced in the DSR, there was several $billions. There's a debate about whether it's $4.5 billion or whether it's previous $2 billion plus 2.5 or whatever it is. But
certainly billions anyway.
In any case, quite a large amount of new money was allocated in the DSR specifically to the guided weapons and explosive ordnance enterprise. In that, the DSR required the Department of Defence to develop a plan on how they would spend that money, and that would include local industrialisation activity.
Yes.
And they are required, it was in the public domain, and that document required them by, I think it was at least by middle of this year, to come back to government and tell them how they will spend that money. Now, because that doesn't require new money, and it's already announced, my expectation is that will be relatively uncontentious when it comes to government, and will simply be proving a plan on how they're going to go about spending that money.
It's remained a very high priority for the ministers, hasn't it? Yeah. Richard Miles and Pat Conroy have both spoken about the urgency and importance of that guided weapons investment.
Yeah. So I think that I'm sure that that's an easy task for Defence to say how we want to get about this. They've got lots of things they need to do, may not be able to do them all, but they will certainly pick some things to do there. And then that should be in the timeline that DSR called for, in a similar time frame to that IIP. So the second half of this year, I think that both those two things should free up the contracting mechanisms of Defence to actually go about issuing contracts in both those areas. So I think that's going to be critically important. It will certainly be around guided weapons and explosive ordnance, but the IIP is much broader than that, and that will touch on a lot of different programs that are currently being sort of reviewed or held up or
certainly
under question
munitions
mark.
Should be part of that too. So the two business areas, munitions and guided weapons, there should be some momentum starting out of government over the course of this year.
Yes, and the DSR was clear about, so they capture it all under the banner of GWIO, so guided weapons and explosive ordnance is all captured, and in that DSR it called about increasing inventory of war stock, and it talked about establishing domestic industrial capability. I fully expect both those things will occur. We need more money than that to really prepare Australia for large-scale conflict, or simply to contribute more meaningfully to our biggest allies who are currently gearing up to support existing conflicts and future conflicts.
Well, they're gearing up because they want to deter conflict.
Yes.
They're not able to meet all of their own needs. They'll be able to meet more of those as they gear up, but they're certainly looking to Australia as a contributing partner and not a needy partner.
Yes.
Well, Rob, great to talk with you, and fascinating to see a company that started in 1973 doing sporting shooter supply, then shifting in the way that you have, and in a very timely way. It's 28 short years of developing the company to where you have, but I think you've got the foundations there that fit with our strategic needs. So it's fantastic to have this chat with you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Appreciate the time.